Hi everyone, and welcome to this month's Financial Transformation Live. So I'm going to give everyone a few minutes just to get started. If you're with us already, then please say hello in the chat. It's always good to see who's listening live, as I know a huge amount of our audience do listen back to these on demand. So today's session is all about budgeting, and I'm going to talk about how do we shift to a more agile budgeting approach. And I'm a big believer in there's no one size fits all for anything. So I'm going to talk about some of the things to consider when you're deciding on your budgeting approach. As always, if you've got some things that you would like to get out of today's sessions, then please do pop them in the chat now. Is there a question you need answered? Is there something that you want to learn more about? And I'll, even if it's not in my current content, if I can deal with it here and now, I will do. So pop your thoughts and what you'd like to get out today into chat, and we'll get started. So while we're waiting for everyone to join us, because I don't know about you, but I try very hard to be on time for these sessions, but generally I'm normally the one that rocks up like 3 minutes late. So let's just talk about today's session and what I've got planned. So we're going to talk about some of the different budgeting approaches that you can take. I'm going to talk about some almost the levels and the layers that I think about when I'm thinking about budgeting. How do we measure budgeting performance? I'm going to share actually it's not mine. I'm not going to take credit for it, but one of the budgeting maturity levels that I like, and I've sort of measured myself and our team against, and some of the things you need to consider when you're putting that in place. But as I mentioned, the point of today's session is very much for you guys to get out what you want. So if there is a question you want answered, if you just want to say hello and you just want to learn what I have to say, then please pop that in the chat as well. Be great to get feedback and hear from our live audience as well. So amazing. Just to start off with, those of you that haven't been on one of these sessions, my name is Hannah. I'm transformation lead here at ITAS. So my job very much is about bringing innovation to how we deliver, helping the team build frameworks and working with the team on particularly challenging transformation projects, because that's where I get my buzz. But ITAS, we're a Sage partner, but we're very much focused on transformation within that. So we see Sage Technologies as a tool to drive transformation and change versus it being the key driver. So that's why I started these sessions, because actually the frameworks that we use internally are actually applicable to not just Sage environments, but also general finance. So I'm hoping that you guys are going to get value from the things I'm sharing with you. I feel like I'm bragging a little bit, but ITAS, I think we were one of the first Sage and Tech partners ever in the UK. Whether we're the first or a very close second, I'm not sure. But we've won numerous awards for our work with both 200 and Intact. And we've also won a few awards with our favorite community, Gen CFO, as well. So, and that's all about these transformation lives. So the idea of these is that even though we are a Sage partner and that's where our technical expertise is, the principles and things that we talk about are not Sage specific. So please don't feel like you have to be working with Sage to be able to use this content. It's very much about builds is the things that go around the technology that we talk about on this session. So just for those of you that are interested, so I am opening up my diary over the next quarter for a couple of 1 hour review sessions. So if you've been following along these sessions and maybe you've put some into practice, maybe you've struggled, maybe you just want some feedback on what you've done, then please do feel free to reach out. I do actually have 2 sessions that I'm offering for free for any of our Financial Transformation Live attendees, but also our podcast listeners. So if you want me to help you review a set of requirements, review an integration mapping, review your transformation plan, then please do. I am aware that I have promised one person's set of requirement examples, which I will have in the not too distant future. So so that's on my list as well to produce. So lots of requests that we've had through for further content as well. So just please do keep them coming. I am trying to get through as much of those as I can, as quick as I can, as part of this piece. For those of you that didn't get a chance to attend or listen to the last session, so we talked about getting audit ready from from a processes and systems perspective, because they are a key part of passing your audit, right? I'm not going to talk about the fact that you need to balance your balance sheet, but what I talk about is some of the ways that you can use technology and process, systems and processes to help you pass your audit and to stand out and to get that gold star from your auditors. So that session's now available on demand, and you can access it either via YouTube if you want to see the screen and the slides, or you can listen into it on the podcast. Okay, so let's talk about budgeting approaches. So incremental budgeting. So this is probably what most people have had experience with. So the traditional way of saying, right, we want to grow by 10%, so let's just budget and increase everything by 10%, right? So and that is absolutely one, a lot of people do base budgets on that. The challenge with that is that it is very it's open to interpretation. So, for instance, if you want to improve, increase your number of opportunities, you might just think that all you have to do is increase your marketing budget by 10%. But if you've saturated the style of marketing that you've done, i.e., you can't, that may not be actually the case in terms of that may not drive the increase in opportunities, right? So it's a very rudimentary and crude way to budget. In some instances, it works really well, but what it doesn't take account of is things like limits, capacities, and kind of the assumptions that go behind that kind of piece. It also can sometimes lead to you like just assuming costs that already exist rather than actually taking the time to review them. So incremental budgeting for me is a tool in the toolbox, but it should generally be used in conjunction with one of the other methods. So zero-based budgeting is obviously the opposite extreme. So that's when you actually start with a completely fresh slate and build it from scratch. So the great thing about that is it really it gets you to examine costs and think from the ground up what you actually need. But it can be incredibly time-consuming. And it can actually, you can miss things, right? So because so if you're going to do zero-based budgeting, which is absolutely a great way to approach this, you need to kind of do a sense check against your existing budget lines, your existing spend lines, to make sure that you've incorporated everything. Okay, so I guess incremental budgeting, great if you need to get something out quickly. And you just want rough cut budgeting, maybe that's the way to think, maybe that's how we should look at it. Zero-based budgeting really gets you to analyze and understand where things are coming from. But it can be incredibly time consuming, and it doesn't always, unless you combine it with other methods, it doesn't quite give you the flexibility that you need for a more agile approach. And for me, that's where scenario-based budgeting almost can stand alone in itself, but it can also be used in conjunction. So certainly the most impactful CFOs that I've seen have actually combined different approaches. So they're not just taking a one-size-fits-all approach to every budget. They're adapting and combining different methodologies, and they're working with multiple versions of a budget. And I think this is where we're getting into more agile budgeting, but also more impactful budgeting, because we're budgeting based on assumptions. So if something happens, so we hit our sales number, if we hit this, if we hit that, or if the external factors do this, they do that, this is what the impact's going to be, and this is where our budget should sit. So it allows us to plan and think ahead, but also adapt and shift as we go through the year with that more scenario based. So and I think I don't think you can go wrong with the three tiers. So things are going well. We hit our sales numbers perfectly scenario. This is when the sales is working at optimum levels. This is where the budget should sit. If our average, so this is not far off what we've done this year, and low is that there's some kind of external effect that might hit us. So if you're going to do scenario-based budgeting, I'd say at least the three, but you may then want to layer that with if inflation hits this, what's this going to do we think, to what we're working on? Okay, so when I've seen budgeting work well is that it's a very dynamic and multi-layered approach, but that brings complexity. So one of the things you kind of need to understand, and we'll talk about this, is like, where are you at in your budgeting maturity? So if you've never done a budget as an organization, then sometimes just keeping things simple is a good way to go. You don't want to go for the overly complex approach. But if you've done budgeting for a few years, maybe it's just within your finance team are producing a budget, then actually that's a great opportunity to go out and start building more collaborative budget and adding layers and complexity into how you structure your budgets. Okay, so there's generally two budgeting approaches, and actually some people that I follow have done some really great work on this. So I think this is my summary of what I think the pros and cons of both are. But top-down budgeting is when you start from the strategic level. So you say strategically, if we want to hit our strategic goals, yeah, this is what we need things to sit at, right? So this is where we need to be financially. And it's very top level. It's driven by top down, and it's driven by where the organization wants to go. So it can be a lot quicker to put out, because obviously it's a small number of people in a room deciding on those goals and where we go. It ties in your budgets to your strategic goals. So you can, you're thinking very much about your short-term and your long-term investments. It gives a great overarching perspective across the organization versus, a working and a siloed department perspective. The challenge I see is when this is used on its own as a siloed approach, is that it doesn't tend to drive connection with reality in some instances. The number isn't necessarily based on what your current capacities, what your current capabilities, what your current situation is. It's driven by, this is where we want to be. So it often doesn't take into account individual departments' requirements. So, and that can be maybe, you've not had that conversation with them about their resource requirements, etc. So and very much it can be, if it's delivered in the wrong way, so if it's just handed over to departments, say this is your budget, then that doesn't drive ownership and accountability, and very often it just gets ignored in some instances, depending on or looked upon, especially if it's a very ambitious budget. It can be seen as overly ambitious and non-achievable. So you've got to find the balance. Bottom-up budgeting is the complete opposite. So it's when you work with individual departments to put the budget together and push it up. So then that allows, your marketing team to say, right, what's your current cost of acquisition? What would you need in terms of budgeting spend to hit this number of ops? Sales, right, in order to hit the, what do you need from a budgetary perspective to hit this revenue number, etc. So you're working with each team to kind of push up what they want and what they need. So the great thing about it is that people kind of argue with something that they've put together themselves. So if they've said that this is what they need to be able to hit this number, then if you give it to them, then it's they've got accountability for that. It allows people that understand how an area or an operational department works to actually define what is achievable and is possible. So again, you're improving not just accountability, but the realism of what you're putting together. And it allows you to really understand the assumptions and scenarios that sit underneath your budget. The challenges around that approach is obviously that it's time consuming, right? You have to work with multiple stakeholders across different departments, right? Very often, especially in large organizations, and if bonuses or performance reviews are based around those targets, then it can lead to people being not ambitious in hitting the goals, and it can also create a massive gap between what is actually achieved, what the organization wants to achieve versus what the team thinks is possible. So it may not align with your company strategy. So you may want to put investments into other areas of the business. And so that means cutting costs in certain areas, and that may not tie into what people think they need. So for me, the perfection lies somewhere in the middle. So I'm a big believer in that strategic goals need operational alignment. So that that means is you absolutely can set a budget at a top level, look across the organization to say, right, we need to hit this, but then that should be then combined with right, guys, right, this is what we're thinking about. This is the number we need to hit from a revenue and a cost perspective. Help me understand the levers and the assumptions that sit behind that, right? So for me, where you see like most impact is that joint approach, and that can I do think it can almost happen at the same time, but you need to bring it together. And where there is a gap between the bottom up and the top down budget, you need to address it. So I've seen a couple of instances where budgets have been put out into an organization, and there is a massive gap between the two with no real plan to address that. And that for me is where where top down budgeting fails, is because they haven't connected the dots for people and said, look, here's the gap. How do we fill it? Let's put a plan together, and actually taken on board and put budget, resource, and focus around filling that gap. So that's the one thing I would say. But also think about, think about budgeting both top down and bottom up with scenarios as well. So thinking about what does, if your team is operating well, if all the stars align, what does that look like? What is realistic? What do we think is, highly likely and doable, and what's the worst case scenario, so that you can then work those models and take that away and put something together and monitor progress. So as the year develops, as assumptions change, you can then model that through. Again, guys, ask questions, comments would be great, experiences and things that you've learned. And, because I think sometimes we talk about all the good stuff, right? We talk about how we should do things, but we don't always share the war stories. And I try to share some war stories, having, I've worked in finance operations, reporting, analytics for God, I think it's 15 years now. My birthday today, so I'm literally counting the years going, how old was I when I first started? But actually, I think some of the power in community is sharing where we've had challenges, what we've learned when things have gone wrong. Because again, you learn a lot more from mistakes than you do by doing things right. So things to think about when you're structuring your budgets. And I've put these in a certain order, right? Because a lot of people start from sales and work back to marketing. I'm a genuine believer that if you cannot generate ops for your team to work to, you cannot get an accurate sales number. Okay, so for me, I think that's the order that you say, marketing, what's realistic in terms of ops, understanding the different dependencies, so conversion rates, etc., that sit within that. The assumptions that sit within marketing for conversions, assumption that sits in sales, resources and production. So if you sell certain amounts, what does that mean in terms of the resource that you need in delivery, in production, operationally to manage that, and thinking across all of your departments, your IT departments, your finance department to handle the billing, etc. And then, of course, your general overhead. So you should, again, that should be tied into your assumptions. So per FTE, what are your expenses that you on average have, infrastructure, etc. Thinking about what you need to keep the business running and open, all your software, etc. And does that, thinking about the mix of FTE specific. So as we add a new FTE, what are those costs? How do they change in each department? And then also, for, even if we didn't hire anyone else, what would our consistent costs, i.e. rent, rates, all that kind of stuff. And then thinking about layering on top of that projects and investments, because you might look at your finance team and go, right, if we're going to increase and hit our revenue growth of adding, 100 new customers in the next quarter, what does that mean to the capacity that our systems and our processes need for managing billing and credit control, etc.? And you might decide that actually, rather than take add another FTE in, which is what you might need, you might want to make some investments in improving those credit control processes or those billing processes, right? So that's where I see projects and investments. They layer on. So the nice thing about doing it in that way is that what you can then think about is put then if then or statement. So if we hit this number of people, that's when we need to trigger off this investment, this project, and that should deliver this. And so you can have those sort of floating projects that you can shift in and out of budgets or quarters, depending on, key triggers that you hit. So, and that's why I was, when I was talking about scenario, you might call it trigger-based budgeting, but thinking about, as I hit this scenario, this is what I need to turn on. and what's that going to cost me, and what does that mean in terms of investment, etc. So projects and investments, and again, it allows you, if you think about them separately, is to think about not just short-term goals, like how do I hit this revenue target next quarter, but longer term, what is the strategic investment we're going to make in R&D, for instance, or in capabilities and skills, and what's that going to mean? So it allows you to sort of separate out day to day with those key investments, and I do think good budgets are layered in that way, and have that level of you can pull things out, shift things around. Okay, so for each of these areas, what you need to think about is what's your ambition, where do you want to be, but also understanding limits and capacity, because the natural inclination is just to go, right, if we increase this by this, it's going to be linear, because it isn't always, right? So there are certain, you can go linear up to a certain point, and then you've got just like with the break even, you've got a point at which you need to invest maybe dramatically more to hit that next level. So thinking about all of these things in that way and not assuming that there's a linear progression. Again, that's the challenge with the incremental piece, is that it's very linear. And life is not linear, especially at the moment. It is very dynamic, and we need to be able to adapt and think things through properly. And also understanding, like I talked about dependencies a little bit, but I'm a big believer in dependencies. So in order, thinking about the way that you lay, so you might invest heavily in marketing, and if they hit a certain number of ops, then you can increase the sales team, and then understanding what that lag time is and thinking through that is also really useful. So, and again, that's why I like a combination of top down and bottom up, is that you get to think about it in that way. Okay, so guys, I haven't had that many questions today, so feel free to if you're listening to this live, to ask any questions. If you are listening to this on demand, please do send me through a message, send me a LinkedIn. If you've got my email, then just email me direct. But it's great to get the feedback on what you're finding useful in how we're putting this together. And also, how much do you detail? Because I know that I've got a real mix of experience listening to this podcast from conversations that I've had. So I've got those that are really deep into, and I've been in that CFO role for many years. And so this is like bread and butter, right? Some of this is really obvious. There's others that are maybe new into role, that haven't been through a budgeting cycle, that are at the very beginning of their budgeting maturity as an organization, where this will be very different. So again, would love to hear your feedback on what areas you're finding useful and what areas you'd like more improvement on. So I, like anything, right, whether this is process improvement or any kind of approach, I do think you need to have some way of measuring the value of what you're doing. So I do genuinely believe, a bit like reporting, is that budgets need to be valuable to the organization, right? So in order for them to be valuable, it means that they need to be produced in a way that is, obviously delivers accuracy, but it also should not be too onerous a process and take too long, because by the time you put your budget together, and I have seen this in organizations, they'll literally be mid-year before they even give the budget out to people. So then people are scrambling and that budget's already out of date. So one of the things you really need to think about is the time and resource it takes to complete a budget. And if that is not delivered, like if it's taking a huge amount of time and it's not delivering a huge amount of value to the organization, then that's something that you need to address. And when I talk about value, does your team, your department heads, does your organization feel the value from the process that they're going through? Because I think it's also a great opportunity to give your department heads, your management team, a chance to think through what they're doing. It's part of the strategic planning process. So, asking the question, like, did you find it valuable? Did it challenge assumptions that you thought you had? Did it make you think differently? That sort of ad hoc feedback is really useful. But from a sort of a practical and measurable perspective, some of that stuff is not, qualitative. So things you can look at is how much time and resource did it take to complete? Looking at the variance. So if you're working on a scenario-based model, you should be generally following the midline. So you might drop into those scenarios, those sort of, where things are going great scenarios or things are challenging scenarios, but generally you should be along the midline. So understand the variance not just from that midline, is also really important. So, was your midline pretty much, across the board close to where you needed to be? And what's the percentage variance? Iterations as well. So if you get 3 months in and you have to completely wipe the slate and start again, unless there was a major event, i.e. like COVID, that wiped everything out, then you should be asking yourself, like, why was our first projection or first adaptation, first set scenarios so far off, and where did we go wrong? So really thinking about analysing where and how you could improve that budgeting process is really important, and understanding the number of iterations that you have during that year. And also not thinking of this as a yearly process, thinking of it as a 12 months ahead process that gets done each quarter. And that should hopefully give you a much more agile approach to budgeting as you move forwards. So this is, I guess, just a question for you as an organization. So I think one of the key things, like with this, and I'm the same with reporting, right? You've got to balance complexity with speed, right? Is that you've got to find the sweet spot for your organization, because perfection is the enemy of speed, right? But at the same time, if you produce something quickly, but it doesn't add value to the organization because it's not complex enough, then you're doing something wrong. So the piece I would say is always think about that balance for you, and almost constantly sense check that process of finding the balance. You are going, if you need high complexity in order to add value to the organization, the reality is that you're going to have to invest in resource, skills, and technology to get you there, because you're not going to be able to get speed if you've got a highly complex budgeting process, but you're doing everything manually in Excel and emails and communications. It's just not going to work. So I think for me, this is where, if you can simplify your model and still get the value out, then you should do so. Don't make it overly complex because you think you should. Find the minimum level of budgeting complexity in order to deliver as quickly as you can. And actually, sometimes it can be, you can accept it or tolerate a higher variance in order to get things out quicker, because actually that adds more value to the organization generally. And I guess that's the hard thing about working in finance and, and that strategic level, is finding the balance and adjusting the balance as your organization goes through their development. Okay. So I just wanted to share this with you, and huge credit to the FP&A board. I've seen a couple of different maturity models, but I really like this. So I thought it was worth sharing with you guys today as a food for thought. So I think one of the key things is to understand where you're at. And we talk a lot about when we talk about change and transformation, is that you need to understand where you are and where you want to be, and understand the degree of change that you have within that. So if you are at the basic level that the FP&A that we've got here, is you haven't got a formal budgeting process, you've got no established analytical capabilities, you've got no modeling tools, no reporting and analytics tools, and you don't normally put budgets together in collaboration with your team, then you're not going to get to leading edge planning capabilities in the next 12 months, right? Unless you make an insane amount of investment, but actually the organization needs to go on that journey. So you need to think about almost how do you get to where you want to be, and what's a realistic time frame. So they talk about basic, developing, defined, advanced, and leading, right? And so some of the key things to think about is, how good is your process, right? Do you have a budgeting process by which you go through, and also they haven't put it in there, but how often do you do it? Is it something that's cyclical, so you do it quarterly, or is it annual? And how, that's the consistency around how often you do, how often you revise, is really interesting. And actually the leading individuals have that much more iterative budgeting process, more agile, versus this is our annual budget, we're sticking to it, and no variance. Do you have, budgets need to be based on data. So in order to put forward good forecasts, to think ahead of where you want to be, what you need to get there, you need to know where you are, and you need to have instant visibility to your key assumption and dependencies, like conversion rates, like marketing spend, like your CAC, your customer acquisition costs, so that you can put marketing budgets together. So I remember having a conversation with someone in finance, and they were like, right, what's the marketing budget? What does the marketing budget need to be? I said, well, that needs to be based on how many customers we want to acquire and our current customer acquisition costs, and that then needs to be sense checked. And that's because it's not always just a percentage increase. Yeah, so you've got to move away from that linear piece. But in order to move away from that linear piece, you need to be able to get that data out of your other systems, not just your finance system, but also your CRMs, etc., in order to sense check your assumptions, because that's where budgets go wrong, is that they are going to be based on assumptions. So in order to get there, you have to do that. And I guess, so we talked about process. So do you have a process you go through? Are people skilled enough? Do they understand the process? Is it established? Do you have the analytics out of the system already within your current landscape of systems and processes across the organization that allow you to make good assumptions for your budget? Do you have a modeling tool, right? So, like if you're on basic, you may not have a modeling tool. So, you've got to build your Excel templates to work in. That tends to be where developing sits. But once you get into those additional layers, is that you need tools that are more robust than Excel, right? So you need that step up in terms of tools that can handle things like assumptions. Yeah, so that you can put in, right, what happens if our customer acquisition cost changes from this to this, right? What does that do to my budgets, and flowing that through? What if our volumes drop, our sales, new customers, new logos drops from this to this? What does that do, and pushing that through? And so managing that through is really important. And that only comes with technology, right? You can build simple models in Excel, but the challenge with that is that it's all too easy for layered assumptions to cause problems with Excel and tools like and then changing those assumptions, redoing all your lookups, etc. So you just need to be like, in order to get to that sort of really advanced level, you do need to look at a robust planning tool. But you can get away with Excel if your complexity is basic, right? So it's thinking about that at what point do you go there? But I wouldn't go for a really fancy planning tool if you don't have the processes and the existing analytical data to base those assumptions on, because you're not going to add value in that way. You're gonna find out that your assumptions are wrong pretty quickly once you get into actuals versus budget, but that's not the point, right? So you need this combination of capabilities in order to do good budgeting. Collaboration, and this is, again, I think even the most even large organizations fall down on this, in that they don't listen to departments, and they don't have that great combination of top down and bottom up. So they're not sense checking the assumptions that they're making. They're not sharing that. They're not getting feedback from those organizations to put it in. It's literally a strategic, this is our budget, this is what we're working through. And that is, again, something that organizations need to get good at in order to hit those advanced levels of maturity. And then, again, it's the time and effort that it takes to put it together. So if it is very manual as a process, if it's very much people pulling spreadsheets together, etc., and the time and the effort it takes, then that again affects your maturity and your ability to roll it on often in an agile way. And then again, predictive analytics, right? So there is some really exciting technology coming that and is starting to appear in the sort of the everyday tools, where it can say, well, if this happens, this is, well, based on what we've seen historically, this is what we think. So getting into that more predictive, that AI piece, but everyone tries to rush this. The piece I would say to you is that is one piece of the puzzle, and like most things, as we do tend to start with technology, and then the piece I would say to you is start with process, start with the strategic focus, and work your way to that kind of predictive capability and the AI piece. So I had a question, how can we streamline the budgeting process to ensure alignment between initial budget projections and current business run rates, minimizing the need for frequent rebudgeting? So my piece is to, one, you need to, I think moving away from a yearly budget and thinking about it yearly is really important. So having a quarterly budgeting cycle is your first step in moving to more operational alignment. What you need to understand, and scenario modeling is a really great way to balance operational and strategic, because strategic tends very often can be very ambitious, and as it should, right? As leaders of organizations, we need to be ambitious. We need to hit the goals that our shareholders and our stakeholders are putting forwards, but that also needs to be balanced to reality. So classic example, you might need to hit a massive 20% uplift in revenue, say, but you may need to stagger that so that you're rather than assuming that you're going to do 20% on each quarter, you might need to have a 5% leap in quarter one, a 10% leap in quarter two, and the rest of that incremental value in quarter three and quarter four, because your marketing needs time to actually iterate and drive that piece, right? There is assumption that if you put money into the pot, all of a sudden it removes the problem. It doesn't. The same with process improvement. If you need to improve productivity, you have a lag time. So I think that's, again, one of the things that people don't think about in their budgets is the lag time for investments to have impact. So that's some of the assumptions that you need to think about when you're putting your plans together. If I invest in that area, how long does it take to see impact? And then building your budgets in that. So if you invest in marketing in quarter one, you will see ops increase in quarter two, and you, depending on your close time and your close cycle, you will see impact in quarter three. So you need to then decide what does that value need to be in quarter three to hit my targets, and then make sure you amp up at the right level in the beginning, right? So then there's cash flow planning, okay? So again, that's where, and it's a great question. So that's, for me, is how you minimize rebudgeting, is actually thinking about reality in conjunction with strategic, and not over-regging the next quarter, because certainly from a revenue perspective, unless you've got incredibly short close cycles, you're not going to hit massive improvements in revenue without having, you're going to have that lag of investment. So that's one thing I would think about. Think about your current capacity and also the lag time you need. So same with delivery. We talk a lot. So in order for us to scale our capabilities, is I need to be thinking 6 to 12 months, because I've got that sort of education timeframe for people to learn our frameworks, to learn how we operate, to get up to speed. So that, thinking about the lag time and investing at the right point. And that's why I say it's really good to work with assumptions. So if we hit this number, or if we want to hit this number, what are the things we need to have in place at what point in order to do this? And so almost having trigger points for investments is something to consider. So it's not, I think the days of having a really static budget, if you're in high growth, if you're in high volatility environments, is just not practical. So actually having trigger-based investment budgets that you turn off and you turn on depending on what numbers you hit is a good way to go. But also involving the departments in putting and understanding those triggers. Because actually, if and working with them to say, right, this is the budget we need to hit. How do we do it? What is the investment you need? And making sure that you give them that investment in a way that they can hit that budget means you're more likely to hit. So budgeting is, and planning is incredibly strategic, but it needs to be based in reality, is my personal opinion. Having seen things happen in a very realistic, having seen budgets being given without any sort of backing and realism around them, and that doesn't lend to consistency, and it doesn't ensure that you're going to hit. And I think that's the piece that in finance we need to make sure that we enable the business to deliver on the targets. And that's if you think about the job is actually making sure that the resource is there, the investment is there to deliver on the company's goals. So it's part of the role within finance, or certainly how I see it, is to challenge, to say, like, how realistic is that, right? What's the lag time? What are the assumptions you're basing that on? What could impact those assumptions, and asking those detailed questions. So documenting assumptions around targets right? And I think sometimes not, numbers can appear out of thin air sometimes with budgets. So really important to understand the logic that sits behind that. And for every number you're putting forward, understand the assumptions, understand if that assumption is linear. So does it change, does it grow? And what sits behind it is really important. Okay. So I thought this was actually going to be a really short session, but it hasn't, but I do hope it's added value. I'm actually going to do it. The next session is going to be all about doing more with less. I think with the current environment, and we're going to talk about how we can maximize efficiency within our finance teams and we're going to call it doing more with less. So how can we find quick wins? How can we identify areas for improvement or added value to the business without necessarily doing massive amounts of investment? So we're going to talk about achieving more and doing less. And if you're interested in that, you can, of course, sign up to it on our website. But you can also don't forget to follow our LinkedIn, and you will get that popping up as an invite as well. So just to summarize what we've covered in today's session, we've covered different budgeting approaches, how you can layer your budgets, in how you can measure the performance of your budgets, and also thinking about where you're at in that budgeting maturity model. We've had some great questions, and there's actually a few that I need to follow up separately, so thank you for sending those through. And if you are interested in, we've got a lot going on at the moment in terms of we're actually working with a number of different budgeting tools, both and we talked about maturity levels. So for me, we're working with a number of tools, both at that early stage, that shift from Excel spreadsheets and that step up to the really complex, powerful enterprise level budgeting tools. So there's if you're interested, happy to share what I've learned and my findings and give some advice, but please do reach out to us. For our existing customers, don't forget that we've run a number of seminars both on 200 and Intact. One is about the Intact budgeting and planning tool. So that can actually be used both with Sage Intact, but also as a standalone as well. So if you're just making that shift from Excel up into a solution, it's a great way, and that helps you manage those assumptions, all those things we talked about in those layers. And also if you're on 200, just talking about how you can use the budgets in there as well. So that the out of the box budgeting capabilities. So for our customers, I hope you find, please do jump onto those sessions, those masterclasses, to help you get more out of your existing software. Okay, well, thank you so much, guys. I hope you found today's session useful. As always, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment to really think about the content that we're producing. And so we're trying a few different formats, we're trying a few different content streams. I would love your feedback. Both good and good and constructive would be welcome. So if you found this session useful, if you feel like I needed to go deeper, I need more examples, any kind of constructive criticism is definitely welcome. Like I said, we operate a continuous improvement policy here at iTest. But if there's a topic that you would like to hear more about, if you feel like there's a session that you would like me to dig into, may even mean me pulling in someone else to help me with them, please let me know. I'd love your ideas, advice, and guidance. So, and for those that are listening on the podcast, please do leave a review. Like a lot of reviews do massively impact our success as a podcast and as a content stream. And it's one of the ways that we measure our success. So please do, if you found this session useful or enjoyable, please do leave a review. Would love to hear more on that for you. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen or to watch. And see you next time on Financial Transformation Live.